Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Low Code Campfire. This is episode number 87 for March 3rd, 2023. This is an event we do every Friday during this hour as an opportunity to get together and talk about Plant and App in specific, low code in general, and we get together and share techniques, challenges, experiences. We hope you'll bring something to show or to ask, and that you'll have ideas and suggestions. This event is recorded and is out on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/plantandapp. We invite you to go to Plant and App and subscribe. We run a agenda where we introduce each other, introduce ourselves. We talk around the campfire just in a pretty unstructured format where we'll do first call and then maybe look at our shared Campfire website, community and feature requests, any submitted topics, and then sometimes we tell ghost stories, areas where we had troubles with the product and had to work hard to figure out how to make it go, or dark corners, just an area that we've explored that we hadn't seen before, even though we're familiar with the product and have been using it for years. After an hour or so, we'll go to our Afterglow segment. That's where we turn off the recording, raise a virtual lemonade, and talk about, well, just anything on a professional or personal level. Do engage with us, please. Jump in, show and tell. You can use the chat window, but main thing is that we engage and have a good conversation. Along the way, be nice. Mute if you've got some noise going on in the background. You can submit questions and topics in advance using either this QR code or the links that are in the emails that we send to you. With that, good morning, all. Happy Friday.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So then I said, good morning, all, and then I have to look and make sure that we don't have international guests that I just offended by US centric. Good deal. First call. What's on your mind?
It's not quite morning for Jim.
But I'm not offended.
Good.
Jim is not easily offended. Nobody for first call. I've prepared a topic, but I don't need to rush to get to it.
I usually remember my first call items about 3/4 of the way through the meeting.
Well, good. Let's see if we can get you there. All right. So I had one. This is actually one I'm submitting. I need help with or ideas about, but anchor tags and listings. And I just wondered if anybody else has encountered this. I kind of have a half working solution, but here's it's some JavaScript. So here's the thing, and it really surprised me quite a bit. I have a listing that generates over in this tall field over here. It generates an anchor tag that you can target with a # like 29. It's got the user ID as an anchor. So if I type 29 as the anchor, it'll get down there. If I type 1 as the anchor, it'll reposition there. So it does what HTML does. But if you jump to this page from another page, it doesn't work right. So I've got a hyperlink to go to that page, and it's got the 29, and it doesn't position. I really would have thought the browser would have been smart enough to wait for my grid to load and to find my anchor, but it's not. Has anybody encountered this before?
I haven't encountered this, but it does make sense in the sense that the grid is Ajax based. So because of that, it's asynchronous. So the page does complete its load. It tries to jump to anchor 29, but anchor 29 doesn't exist at that moment. The browser doesn't care. It doesn't know about it. It just did what you asked it to do. After your request for anchor 29 was processed, the grid finished its load and loaded the data. So what you would need to do is use some sort of, I guess, Java code that would delay your request for Anchor 29, waiting
And-
for the grid to finish its Ajax update.
And we actually found some code like that, and maybe you guys can help me figure out better code. I put in come on, edit the wrong thing. I have a form that has it, that has this code. And so I've just done it as an initialization script. So this is a snippet that I found out on the internet somewhere. And the way that they had set this up with a timeout of 300, so waiting a third of or 3/10 of a second, and then re-changing the hash, resulting in a better result. But it's tied to document ready and not to the grid. So it's just kind of a guess. How long is it going to take for that to load? And I mean, first I'll illustrate. If I do this grid loads pretty fast. I'm on high-speed internet, and so if I come over and use my link with that in place with that 3/10, it'll jump there just fine. But I'm designing this for mobile, and so and a very long listing, and so there's quite a bit of variability into how. I mean, I really need to wait for the grid to load, not for the page to be ready. So
What you really need is an event that says the grid is now finished loading, and there must be one, but I just don't know what it is or how it's exposed. That would be the ideal.
Exactly. So just wondering if anybody had encountered that and knew what that event might be.
I think something similar has come up before, and we've talked about this, that it would be nice to have events and an on-load type of section in the grid or in the listing itself, that you could say, now you've finished loading this page, do these things. But I think it's been a wish rather than I think something we'd found.
Yeah, and I think when we talked about that, it was kind of more in the context of wanting to do things before the listing loaded. Even forms that have those events, I don't know that we have a event that says that the initialization, it not in the events section to say that the event is complete. So.
So I
I
have a suggestion. I think we collectively might consider it to be a hack. You can tell me, but I think that you could put your JavaScript code into your grid results in a row. Like if you could configure the data such that the last row is kind of, I guess that would be kind of important, would contain the JavaScript that you wrote, or some derivation of it, that it would only become visible to the page when the grid had finished loading all the way down to the last row. And then it would jump into action at that point and redirect to that spot.
Yeah, and I think that's a good suggestion. I mean,
I wouldn't suggest that because
you
you don't know what the last row is.
You could know if you did a union and that was at the bottom.
Not necessarily, because your page could have different items per page, different counts. You don't know what the last row that's visible on the screen is going to be at the time of your SQL run.
So oddly enough, in this particular case, I'm not allowing sorting, and I have full control of the row content. So I think I could use that if sorting was involved, and I don't have any pager involved.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If you remove the pager, if you set it so that it's 1,000 records, and you'll never get close to that, you're guaranteeing that everything loads. That's one thing. But if you have pages, there's no guarantee that a SQL situation like that would actually function. However, my suggestion would be similar to that, but not at the SQL level, not at the data source level, but within the grid, those data fields, add a computed field with Java code in there, and then state that if, let's say for argument's sake, your anchor is the row number, and you have the row number as part of your result set,
I love it.
then say if the parameter that's sent to the URL matches the record ID of that row, then execute this JavaScript, which will in turn do the jump for you. So it won't do the jump until it actually sees the row that you're looking to jump to.
That sounds good. I like it.
I like it, and really that's so I was closer to Mark's kind of between this. I had tried doing a summary field and trying to put it down to force it to be at the bottom of the grid, but I like yours a lot. So let's see, if I were this is where I'm generating the tag. And I happen to be using div instead of anchor. That was one of the things that I was thrashing about trying. But if we were to come in here and add it to the bottom of this and conditionalize it, and that's this one would do it for every
Row.
Yeah, you wouldn't need the ready part. You'd just run it.
Yeah.
Well, my suggestion only because if you put the code directly in it, it's going to run for every single row, which will take CPU cycles. So the way I was looking at it is define a function that you attach to window that does your actual jump. Then if you add a computed field and in the conditional statement of the field, say that the field is only visible when the query string matches your row number, then that field becomes visible. Call your function, and then it'll only run that one time. It won't be a function that will be continuously running on every single row.
Right. And yeah.
That's a good suggestion.
That's an excellent suggestion. I will give that a try. It's
Jim, were you trying to contribute to that, or was that the next topic you had?
I had an idea, but it wasn't as good. So myself, it was a similar sort of idea, but not as elegant.
You hear that, Ben? You have an elegant solution.
I like elegance.
It's a very desirable characteristic in computer code.
Yes, it is.
I try.
all right. I'll have to report back on that. Okay, so I got it started. What else do we have?
I have a question. What's the proper way to understand page load times? I know that you had done something, I think last week, Dale. But when I went to test some pages and try to record kind of before and after, I was not getting could either not so much inconsistent results, which you can expect because of different factors, but there's about 26 different ways you can measure speed. I just want one that's kind of a correct overall number. Am I asking too much?
If you define what correct means, then it's
It's what the definition of is.
no. I think we can do is. Are you mainly concerned with users' perception?
Yes,
Okay.
that's
So
pretty much it.
Yeah. So for a user to perceive that the page has loaded, does everything have to be there, or is a placeholder or a spinner appearing? Is that enough for the user to be satisfied, or does it
No.
have to be? It has to, as when it gets into a usable state.
Correct. Like when it's done, complete.
That's difficult when you've got Ajax things going on to track, because most of the page load metrics are to do with building, scaffolding the page, not actually completing all of the Ajax.
Yes. Well, I think you're striking at the heart of the inconsistencies that I was finding. Because, yeah. So
I noticed that you signed up and then canceled for office hours yesterday, and I was wondering, are you still having the same problem with the questions, the delay with the questions loading in that same form that we were looking at? Is that what you're talking about right now?
well, yes and no. I think
Okay.
what I was trying to do was come up with a before and after. So before was as it existed, and seeing some rather substantial page load times. Then I had my server upgraded. Basically, I think I added 4 more cores to it and another 4 gigs of memory. And I said, okay, let me see, check and see if I can figure before and after. I thought I was good before, and then I started to measure after. Like, that's why the answer to the question really is when the user, in fact, the page isn't ready until, in this case, let's say it's Ajax, until Ajax is done, and in this case, the form is really, really ready to be, it's been displayed and accepting input.
I think the biggest issue you're going to have with trying to figure that out is it's not something that you can put in a module, because you have multiple modules that are loading. Every single module would then have to report when it's finished its load. You can't just put code into one module and say that one's gonna respond and say, yeah, the page is completely done, because something else can still be loading that it's not aware of.
Well, I understand your point. In this case, I'm pretty sure then that it's just one module loading, and it's complex. There's a lot going on, and what I was, like I said, the inconsistency was, it was significant in terms of what the user was perceiving versus what I was measuring or thought I was measuring in the console here. So I guess the question is there a way to measure the user perception of a page load short of a stopwatch? And if I'm hearing Jim correctly, and maybe this is what you're saying too, is that it has a lot to do with what happens after the browser is done, but Ajax isn't done, if I understood it correctly.
Yeah, that's right. I think if there was a particular element that that's the, as you say, it's ready to accept input, you could track to see when a particular element was rendered and ready. But you were saying you're getting inconsistent results. Were you getting inconsistent results on network traffic? Because very often that's the variable, is that, if you look at your network tab, you see that you know you get the waterfall of things happening, and sometimes that the delay is there, and that won't necessarily be fixed by upgrading the server. There can be you know many things in between that will compromise that.
Yeah. So it's actually when the inconsistency was my overall measurements, you know, in terms of what I was seeing as a result. I'm trying to look at some numbers here. But I was getting you know, page load time. Oh, I don't have my notes handy, but I was getting a page load time from, you know, visible something like 6 seconds. And of that, 5.59 of it was waiting for the server, you know. So that clearly would get positively affected by upgrading the server. And I saw overall about a 30% jump in performance, but I was trying to say, okay, what am I missing in this network tab that will be the definitive answer? And I think the answer is there is no definitive answer, if I'm hearing you guys correctly. Okay, all right. So short of that, then, it looks like the waterfall is the most appropriate metric question.
That I would say that's the thing that's most likely to be consistent across lots of different clients, because you know when it comes to processing and rendering the page, that will be affected by the particular device they're doing, what they've got cached, what they've had to load. But the one thing that you have some control over is the number of network calls and their duration. So I would, if you're finding it slow, that's the place I would look first to see if there's anything obvious. And adding more virtual hardware to a server does not necessarily make it respond any faster. It depends what it's trying to do, and it depends on, you know, how many, you know, what the balance between the database and the web server is, and you know how many you can add more cores, but they're not being dedicated to the task you need it to. It's not necessarily going to help.
Yes,
but yeah. So I if it was a problem, I would always start with the network tab and see what I can improve there, and then simplify the page as much as possible. The less it has to do, the faster it renders.
Yes. Well, that's the path I'm going down. A question on this time column: are those numbers cumulative? In other words, you go in Dale's example, it goes 23 milliseconds to 24 to 41. Is 41 the sum total at that point? Or is that 41 additional on top of the 24?
So I believe.
I think it's for each individual item.
I agree. And I just happen to have it sorted by time so that I can spot whatever it is that I think is the most, that's taking the most individual amount of time. But down here, there is this finish and done, and so load time and finish time. So just I've been experimenting here. If you clear this out, and I'm going to do a shift refresh, so making it read everything. So uncached, we're seeing load time of 6 seconds. If I clear that out, 6.3.
Where are you getting 6? Oh,
clear that out and refresh again. So without holding that down, I'm getting, so with some cached response, it's 4.47.
okay. Finish. Okay.
So I believe this is kind of okay. Everything's come in on the initial load, right? DOM content loaded, and you could look these up, DOM content loaded, and get a better definition than what Dale's opinion is. But this appears to be the user perceived done. the page has stopped
Mhm.
doing anything. So that would give you a very gross number to start to impact. I agree entirely with Jim that there's a lot of this that's subjective or based per user, because things like it JavaScript is running on your page and going out and asking for more things. And your browser is running, going out and asking for more things. So I could imagine that if you had somebody who had a very low processor, their on their local client could impact what their total perceived load time is. Right?
Yes, without a doubt.
So there's things that you can impact, things that you can't. But if you start on a single processor, yours, and run it, and you have a 10-second load time, and then you improve that to get a 5-second, everybody's going to benefit from that. So I mean, I would just start with it from how can you improve it on yours and measurably improve it.
So back to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, I was going to add on some things that I've noticed. First of all, I agree with Jim also on, yes, you're changing your hardware behind your virtual hardware, say behind the IIS server and the database server, are going to be easy ways to improve the number. And easy ways to test to see if the number improves. But I would add on to it, you're doing dynamic content, and I have noticed that dynamic content just takes longer, period. There's extra steps required to do that. And then worse yet, what you're doing is a pretty complex SQL query to get the content that's going on. So at runtime, you're running queries to retrieve what's the next right what's the content for this page. There's no way to pre-know what to do that, right? Or you're doing it dynamically. So there, and all that is being by SQL queries. So just kind of other suggestions to think about. One is making sure that your database queries are tuned, that you're asking efficient, asking to get data from the server efficiently. And if you need to have SQL indexes on fields to better get to where you're going, you might be able to improve the queries that way. And then, I mean, I don't know your application that well, but if there was any way to anticipate what the next page needed to load, so if you already know when they hit the button, there's a set of questions that you're going to ask next, in theory, you could generate that content in advance, meaning run the SQL query and store it in a simplified manner, so that when they do push the button and they go on, all the heavy lifting has been done in advance. And it's just pulling back the JSON that you predetermined they're going to need.
Yeah.
But that would be like next level.
Right.
Content.
Okay, to circle back though, if I may, to the original kind of question, that finished 4.4 seconds you're showing on your screen, that does not necessarily include whatever Ajax is doing in addition to. Is that a correct understanding?
I believe this is showing everything. There is no more anything going on this page at 4.47. I believe the 2.78 is the page. You got the initial content without the Ajax, the extra things that are going on. I believe that to be true. I'm not sure, but 4.47 when it was done.
Yeah. So kind of to circle back on your other point, I know you've been at least inside somewhat what I've been working on, Dale, and Patrick too knows my travails. So yeah, what I'm going to do is exactly that, simplify the whole thing. move as much of it as possible down into, in this case, likely into a view. I'm pre-building everything, and then the view is running on SQL as opposed to in the client, and then pre-building as much as possible, and then fetching essentially rows from the queue to build out, to display the question, and then of course, hopefully have the next question ready to go. But just starting down that path now. So thank you.
To the degree that, and so now that gets back to, you know, if you, to the degree that you're, that it's based on that query running. I mean, what I'm trying to say, if you clean up other things and you can't get past, okay, now it's the query, how long does the query run, which you could probably get some statistics on from Performance Monitor or something like that. But more efficient queries, and I'm guessing that Ben and Jim, I know you deal with large data sets, probably have some thoughts about query improvement.
If I ever have a situation where I'm running a SQL query that's extensive and complicated, and I'm trying to figure out what's eating up the time, I don't know how others do it, but what I tend to do is I inject start and stop times in different chunks of my script. I run that in Management Studio, SQL Management Studio, and I have it spit out what the elapsed time is from start and stop. So basically, like I'll dump the date time into a variable, run a SQL statement, you know, a select statement or whatever, and as soon as it's done, I do a print with an elapsed time. I have a function that actually converts it into like hours, minutes, seconds, whatever. And then if there's different sections, I just keep doing that, resetting that variable to the start time, and then spitting out the next elapsed time. So then I could start seeing different sections of my code, what's eating up my time. If I find that there's something that's excessive, then that's when I focus on that, because I know that's where I need to speed things up if possible, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. So thank you. In my case, I think, and I don't want to monopolize the time here, but in my case, what I'm doing is once that SQL code, the query runs, which is, you know, reasonably efficient, but certainly can be improved. It's actually when it gets back to the form, I've got to do a lot of logic testing based on what I'm getting back in the query. I'm doing that in the form. And I believe that's where the slowdown is. So I've got to take and move the logic back to the SQL. So I'm just simply grabbing rows.
I was gonna say, what type of logic are you doing? Because I've had situations like that where, let's say, for example, I have a grid loading from a SQL, and I would have some logic and tokens that would run inside the fields, but it would run per row, which caused the entire grid a severe slowdown because it's got to crank all of that information on every single row. And the other thing too is that is being processed. If I'm not mistaken, a good chunk of it is probably, yeah, it is being processed at the client side. So you're now at the whim of the processing power of your client as opposed to the processing power of your server. So in many of those cases, and it, like I said, it has bit me, what I've done is I moved a lot of that logic to determine certain things to the SQL side, maybe dumped it into an extra field with a final value, something that's easier, that doesn't need to be calculated, but is just used as a flag. Right. And then that's what I use in the grid, because it basically will process that information a heck of a lot quicker than doing mathematics or computational stuff or any type of logic at the client side. All it's basically saying is, for example, if I want to change the background color of a box, this is just an example. Instead of
Mhm.
saying on the client side, well, if the value of what's in the box is greater than 50, make it green. If it's less than 50, make it red. Instead of doing that, I would do that calculation on SQL and then dump into a field and say background color, red,
Yeah.
green, and then
Yeah.
just use that in the field. So the client's not doing calculation, it's just running what
Yeah.
you tell it to run.
Yes, and that's precisely the point at which I am. I am going to take I've already started essentially creating a view that's a composite of a bunch of, in this case, a bunch of different tables. Now I've got to figure out what logical pieces and components I need to put into that query to build the table in such a fashion so that the browser / form just goes and grabs a row, and then the row's got what it needs for that instance, for that moment in time, for that row to be displayed, in this case, as a field within a form. And then, that's where I've got to go next, and then I'm getting there. But so yes, totally agree.
Optimizing SQL queries is a dark art that people get paid an awful lot of money for. So there's a lot that can be done with execution plans and all that sort of thing. We found that using views and maybe having views referencing other views helped, because the more that a view is run, the more that SQL Server learns how best to produce the result. So it can having consistent chunks and linking them together rather than doing everything from scratch can be helpful. And also, very often you'll find denormalizing helps. We had a very nice data structure for our online shop, and with all sorts of joins and inners and outers and all sorts of things, and the data was only in one place. And while it was very, very pleasing to look at, it really wasn't very efficient, and we had to flatten things down and repeat data to get it to respond quickly when it was under heavy load. So that's another thing to think about. Some, although it was quite volatile data, some of that data was quite static. So we flattened down the more static data into tables that were maintained on a schedule, and only built the dynamic bits that we needed to. So there's an awful lot that can be done. And the other thing, of course, is that in order to render a page, you might have your main query, which drives your form. But of course, DNN, by its very nature, is doing lots and lots and lots of other queries just to render that page, so that it's not just the one query that's happening. There's a lot going on at the same time. So the more efficient you can make it, you get bigger benefits.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, on a side note, similar to what Jim was just mentioning, and I know, Matt, that you said that this is probably not so much with regards to query speed, but for anyone who's listening to this, because this literally just bit me the other day, and took me a while to kind of track down. According to documentation, filtering records based off of an inner join or within a where clause should be optimized equally with SQL. So it really shouldn't make a difference, and both of them should run the same. I was doing a situation where I was trying to find if records were deleted. So I was basing it off snapshots. So for example, one day I would take a snapshot of the data and I would hash out the unique fields to make everything unique, and I'd store that into a table. The following day, I'd run it again, store that into a temporary table, look at the hash values against my last day's table to see if there was any differences, if there were anything that was there yesterday that is not there today. In order to do that, I was saying where the hash value is not in, and then do a select statement of the hash values that were in the other table. I literally ran it, and it wasn't even a whole lot of records, like 180,000 records. Um, I never got to finish it. The thing ran for 36 minutes at the longest, and I just killed it because I said, you know what? This cannot be right. There's got to be something else. And I spent a day and a half, and everywhere said, you know, that this should work. I was doing var binaries, trying to speed up, not doing text, things like that. Ultimately, what I ended up doing is an inner join, or rather a
Yeah.
left join. Sorry, I did a left join, and then I said in the where clause where the hash value is null, which would then show me what was missing.
Right.
It literally ran in 4 seconds.
That's
Very big
significant.
difference. Very big difference. So you'd be surprised where you think, you know, you're writing everything absolutely right, but it's just the way the SQL optimizer decides to actually run your code. It should run it faster, but it doesn't. So there are times, there's even situations where I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I used it once or twice, where I had to actually give a hint. There's a hint command in your SQL that you can tell it how to optimize the actual where clause. And I've had to actually do that because the optimizer would pick the wrong way, would do table scans as opposed to hashed. So I would say, you know, like, don't do this way, do it this way. And as soon as I did that, again, same idea, something that would take 10 minutes all of a sudden took 20 seconds.
Right. Wow, good to know. Thank you. Much appreciated. Thanks for that hint.
I had never heard of that before.
What, the hint command? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a SQL expert by any means.
Yeah, I don't use it very often. You know, the one thing that a lot of people say about the hint command, while it's useful in certain situations, the problem is if your data structure were to change, or the type of data in there, there's a possibility that your hint in the future can actually hurt you, and the optimizer would do something better. So you kind of have to, you know, measure it as, you know, to the best of your ability, and keep an eye on it. If you see that, you know, that same statement in the future starts behaving badly, then you have to go back and wonder, you know, is it the hint? Take out the hint, see if that speeds things up, because the optimizer at that point might find a better way than what you're hinting.
Yep, it's basically acts as an override, and so you're saying I know better than SQL does, and you may. SQL may change, right? The next version of SQL might evaluate it differently. So interesting.
So Dale, something that we talked about earlier that you brought up might have some play in a previous conversation. I think I was just putting it together that if you had such a page where you had multiple components loading on it, multiple modules loading on the page, and the heavy one was a listing, like your example earlier, then I think maybe you could be in more control of how the page loads visibly by running some JavaScript in that last row of the heavy listing. You know, we talked about how do we get a page to load the way we want it to load, in the right order, the module showing up in the right order. Well, if you were to hide or display none modules except for your listing, and then if the listing is the last thing, it could fire the Java script code that would reveal things in the order that you wanted them to reveal. And they would all be there. They'd all be loaded and ready to go, but they would just be revealed at that point. Anyway, we talked about doing that several different ways, and one of them was to sort of keep waiting, set your timeout longer and longer until you've got it. But that is not variable, but the load time on the longest loaded item might be a good way to do it.
I was thinking the same way, piggybacking on Ben's elegant idea of having a computed field on that grid or something that when it matches the row count of how much data, you know.
Yeah, we're talking the
Do-
same thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just have to be careful that where you put that code, if it's, the quote unquote last row, that it's what's actually going to be visible on the screen. If your SQL query is bringing back 250 rows, but the user is set to show 10 rows per page, your code is never going to run until they hit the last page. They have to page all the way through. So that's why I'm saying you have to be very careful with that type of logic, because you can't control, unless you know your grid is never going to exceed a certain number of rows, and you make that as your only page amount so that you get no pages and you force every single data row to show, there's no real way for you to guarantee that that code is going to run if you embed it within your SQL as a return value directly on just one of those rows, if that makes sense.
It would be interesting to see if there already is an event that is loading done, or if we could.
Yeah, it would be so nice to have a pre-init and those sorts of steps in the listing, just as there are in the form, that you could say once it's got to this state, do these things.
There actually is something, but hold on, let me just double check.
And there is an open feature request.
For that very
Look.
thing.
Yes, with 8 votes on it.
Yes, there is a event, DNN SF dot events dot on open paren quote grid loaded with G lowercase l capital end quote comma, and then the name of a function you want to run, close the paren. And what that will do, you put that on the data source load refresh of the grid. So when basically the data source, it starts loading, you're adding a grid loaded kind of action. So when the grid finishes loading, it runs whatever that function is. I mean, if you want, I can share it on my screen.
Why don't
Sure.
you paste that in the chat
Yes,
window?
please.
Need access to share screen. Which screen is it now? I have too many monitors. This one. Okay, hopefully everyone could see it. So this is my listing. In your advanced UI settings, you've got on data source load refresh JavaScript. This is the main piece right there. So here's the function that I've created, which is formatting my cells based off some information. And as you could see, this is what I was telling you before, Matt. What I'm doing is, rather than do the calculations here, I'm just actually throwing in straight text. And made this a whole lot faster than me having to do cranking of information per row. But basically this says when the grid finishes loading, execute this function. This is the function, and basically this one runs through all of the grid items and just changes background colors and stuff to highlight when certain information is important or not.
Right.
But this will only execute once the data source finishes loading.
I'm noticing that DNN SF line is not in the JavaScript API spreadsheet that we all can have access to.
Yes, I was looking for it too.
Events on, is that, I was looking for it too, so
Mhm.
that's events on is not in there, is that correct?
It is not.
That would be handy.
If you can find, I'm I can find it using console pretty easily. It's there, but that doesn't help with knowing the parameters though. So
yes, we had,
So,
I believe the sheet that is in question, and we can, we should post it for the use of this group. So Patrick, would you put it on there? I think when we came out with that, Radu said, okay, here they all are. It was just a kind of a quick, this is useful. And with the idea that we were going to do something more formal at some point. Oh, this is something I need to put on the list to deal with, to mention to our documentation specialist.
there's, in case anybody doesn't have it, that's the spreadsheet we're referring to.
Ben, can you paste that that line into the chat window, please?
so so this would solve your problem, Dale. This would be the way to get it to jump to that whatever the anchor is.
I think so. So
Ben, how did you know the parameter to put in? Did you get that from support at some point, or is there a way to see the parameters that that we're not aware of?
That's a good question because I've been using this for years.
So you don't remember? Okay, yeah.
I really have no clue. I just know that every time I need something like this, I'm like, wait a minute, I know where I did it. And then I go back and I just like copy paste.
Yeah. I get it. I do that a lot too.
breadcrumbs. Well, if I get this one right, I'll move it to Campfire as well. So maybe we'll have another place to reference where it's done right. Nice.
Worth
Glad
the
I could
price
help.
of admission.
Well, if anyone ever needs off the wall weird solutions, I usually always have something somewhere.
This is why Fridays are good. Yeah. Yeah. Like I say, I was completely surprised that anchor tag just wouldn't work. I mean, you know, I just expect magic to happen without having to do anything extra special with JavaScript. So I was surprised to find that it didn't. Beyond that, again, in my case, when you're testing it interactively, it's you know, the grid's loaded. Okay, I put in an anchor tag, it positions. Okay, so everything's fine, but you don't think about it acting differently when you're coming from another page and it hasn't loaded yet. So it's frustrating. It's one of those.
Yeah. That was a good topic for me, Dale. I was trying to set one of those up just a week ago, and it wasn't going to my spot. It was your use case. It was exactly it. And I had to move on before I figured it out. And so, yeah, now I know what to do with that.
Yeah. All right, we still have 7 minutes. We could do one more.
Hey there.
Go ahead, Don. Sorry.
I was going to actually a big shout out to both Patrick and Dale and also Matthew for his patience. On Tuesday, I jumped on to office hours to be able to work on a project that I've been struggling with being able to play an audio clip and have a little segment of rows of segments of the clip to have somebody follow through. That for anybody who wasn't on the call, and I was struggling with it because I wanted to build JavaScript on the fly, and it wasn't working. I just could not get it to load onto the page. So we worked on it for a long time, and then kind of eventually we said, well, don't do it that way. And so, but that was, you know, I had already taken up a bunch of the time, and apparently Matt and I jumped on to the call at the same time, and he was waiting patiently. So I said, okay, I'll go work on that myself. So I solved the problem. Thanks for the help, putting all of the JavaScript in the settings JavaScript field. And that's the only place where the JavaScript is. Then instead of trying to build an array on the fly, I just used the ID of the element that I was trying to get to be the second SMARC, where I wanted to jump into that segment of the audio, and looping with a get element by class name, and letting the and then running the JavaScript that way. That way I didn't have to have on the fly JavaScript building array. But what I found is that when I was trying to do a loop through the elements that were gathered by the get elements by class name, that if you say element sub X, with brackets, I think action form is jumping in and doing something with it, because the page is saying, sorry, that element name, that variable name doesn't exist. It's undefined. So what I ended up doing is, because that's the the example that everybody gives is, element sub something equals, right? But what I ended up doing was realizing that there's another way of identifying that particular record in the list, and that is item parentheses X instead of sub X. So by putting dot item parentheses X, I was able to replace the bracket X, and then everything started working. So that's how I solved it. So I guess action form does that, and that's, I'm assuming that that action form was interpreting the bracket as a token, tried to replaced it with who knows what, because then at that point JavaScript said that thing that it created is undefined.
You're using parentheses worked for you in replace of square brackets?
Instead of element name bracket X, I have element name dot item parentheses X.
Okay. Because one of the other things that I found is that when you have arrays like that, there is, and this was actually introduced, well, relatively recently, I want to say within the last 2 to 3 years in JavaScript. You could do dot at, lowercase at, and then open paren, and the element number and close paren, instead of using the brackets. Dot at does the same exact thing. Now, what I also noticed, in most cases, I don't think I've noticed it not work, but in situations where my tokens is attempting to hijack your code and replace those square bracketed items as tokens, do square bracket space your value, space square bracket. Put spaces around it. So if you did bracket space 1 space bracket, it will not turn that into a token, and the spaces are ignored by JavaScript. So it would see it as bracket 1 bracket.
Got it. Interesting.
Yes, that whole order of operations, when tokens gets replaced and when they don't get replaced, it's does cause a series of angst. I love it that you said hijack, Ben, because other times you would wish that it would do the replacement and it doesn't. But
Yeah.
I've learned over time, scoping is such a big thing. You really have to wrap your head around scoping when it comes to, especially just this whole environment, planting up your tokens, your action forms, your grids, everything that you write, especially if you're going to go under the hood and start tweaking things. Scoping becomes such a major thing that you really have to get a good grip on. Otherwise, you're not going to get the results you think you're going to get.
And with that, good session, full hour. Thank you all for participating. Hang around for a few minutes if you like. We'll go into Afterglow segment in just a second. Great week. See you guys next week.